Good morning, this is Brian. Today is July 7th, 2019. I am just a little off trail from the Pacific Crest Trail, which is just down there. Came up from Vincent Gap, and today this is another episode of Spotlight on Trees. I am up here, probably about 7,300 feet in elevation, here in the San Gabriel Mountains in Los Angeles County, and I want to spotlight a tree you will see a lot of here in the Angeles National Forest. This is called the Jeffreyi pine, Pinus jeffreyi. This tree is probably the most common conifer here in the San Gabriel Mountains. Usually you start seeing it about 5,000 feet, but it's more predominant above 6,000 feet. And these trees you can see here can get quite large. Most of the ones here in the Angeles are fairly medium sized, but you do get quite a few girthy ones like this guy here. The Jeffreyi pine is a member of the yellow pine group, the subgroup Ponderosa, which of course, inferring from that, you would think, yes, it must be related to ponderosas. Yes, it is, quite closely. In fact, so closely that people often have a hard time telling them apart from ponderosas. Here, where I am hiking right now, there is not one single tree I can look at and say it's a ponderosa. I do not see any ponderosas. Besides a few white firs, some canyon live oak here and there, and an occasional single leaf pinyon, this is basically Jeffreyi Pine City. In fact, on the north side of Vincent Gap, which is where you hike up to Mount Baden-Powell if you go on the other side, on this side, there are spots where it's almost a monotypic stand of Jeffreyi pine. So there are lots of stands of Jeffreyi pine here in the San Gabriels, and it's probably the most common coniferous tree. Most common tree is probably the canyon live oak, Quercus chrysolepis. We want to talk about the most common tree, period. But Jeffreyi pines, they range from around the middle part of Oregon, down the Sierra Nevada, down the Klamath and the Sierra Nevada, possibly in the Coast Ranges. There might be some stands in the Coast Ranges, but don't quote me on that. I've never been to the Coast Ranges. More likely you'll see Ponderosa pine there. So, for the most part, this tree goes down the spine of the Sierra Nevada. It's more prevalent on the east slope of the Sierras. And here in Southern California, it's predominantly everywhere. South-facing slopes, north-facing slopes, east, west-facing slopes. And Jeffreyi pine is here in Southern California and up in the Sierras can get quite large. I've seen trees in the 180-foot range, maybe even a little bit taller. There are some large specimens down by Crystal Lake. In fact, most of those pines are actually ponderosas, but there are a few Jeffreyi pines that are quite large, and there are some huge Jeffreyi pines with huge ponderosas going down to Cooper Canyon from the Buckhorn Campground in the Cooper Canyon area. That's off the Burkhart Trail. Now, Jeffreyi pines also range through San Diego County, so you'll find them here in the San Gabriels. You'll find them all in Ventura County, Santa Barbara County, Ventura County, Kern County, and then they'll be curving towards the San Bernardino Mountains, the San Jacintos, Cahuilla Mountain. You'll find them on Palomar Mountain. You'll find them down the Peninsular Ranges, the Santa Rosa Mountains, all the way down to the Sierra de San Pedro Martir in Baja California, Mexico. So Jeffreyi pine is not a really widespread western tree. Again, it's almost a California endemic. Like I said, it goes from Oregon to Baja. And around Lake Tahoe, it might even be found possibly where the Sierra Nevadas edge into Nevada, possibly. I've never been up towards Tahoe, but Jeffrey pine cones are often quite large. Let's see if I can find a good specimen. This is actually maybe about 3/4 of one. And what you'll notice is the prickles at the end of the cone scales generally point downward and sometimes slightly inward. So when you handle a Jeffrey pine cone, you're usually not going to say, ouch. And this is what they look like when they're young. They often start off narrow and thin, like ponderosas. But then when they get older, they often broaden out more so than a ponderosa. Like this one broadens out quite a bit, and it looks like it might have a flat top. It especially gets flat tops in areas of dry, windy, climatic conditions, like here. It tolerates drought a lot better than a Ponderosa pine. So you will find them in more harsh sites, and you will see them, if you're talking about the Sierras, you're looking predominantly on the east slope of the Sierra, but there are Jeffrey pines on the west slope. I've seen them in Sequoia National Park on the west slope. I've seen them there. So they are there. But in the Sierras, they tend to take over more on the east slope where it's drier, and they mix in with pinyon pines and Sierra junipers, a lot like they do around Big Bear Lake in San Bernardino County, which is the next mountain range over, the San Bernardinos. You'll see them mixing in with Sierra juniper, single leaf pinyon. And in the moisture sites, you'll see them mixing in with a lot of white fir, sugar pine, incense cedar, sometimes even ponderosa. So we get them mixing in sometimes. But here in Southern California, it's much, much more common than ponderosa, at least in my experience of hiking. Most of the places I go, it's predominantly Jeffrey pine. And here in the San Gabriels, they tend to be a little bit smaller because the mountain range is a bit drier. So a lot of those are actually fairly typical sized up here. But again, like I said, there are spots here in the San Gabriels where they get quite large. And in the San Bernardino Mountains, they can get really big. There's another very, very, very important thing about Jeffrey pines. Smelling their bark. Even this young tree, it has a sweet resinous odor emanating from its bark. Some people liken it to violets or pineapples. I like to think of it's like smelling vanilla cookies. So it's kind of like smelling a bakery when you're smelling these trees. And another thing you'll notice is the younger trees, like the ponderosas, have mildly furrowed, dark colored bark. More mature trees, like ponderosas, their bark breaks out into more plate-like structures. So I'll go back to this Jeffrey pine. So you can see this one breaks out into plates. Sometimes the plates can be quite wide, like on the ponderosa. Usually they're a little bit smaller than ponderosa. And most of the time, they'll be more of a reddish brownish color as opposed to a yellowish tannish color like a ponderosa. I mean, these are not always 100%, but if you're here in California, the Jeffrey pine has that vanilla or that sweet bakery odor, while as a ponderosa is supposed to have more of just a typical pine sap smell. Now, people in the Rocky Mountains They describe Ponderosa pines in the Rocky Mountains as also having a vanilla smell, but I've never seen that, and that might be a totally different subspecies. In fact, the Ponderosas here in Southern California and up in the Sierras are Pinus ponderosa subspecies benthamiana or Pinus ponderosa verdipacifica, while the ones in the Rockies are subspecies scopulorum, and the ones in Arizona, I believe, are subspecies brachyptera. So I don't know if they also have that chemical in their bark that gives off that vanilla cookie smell, but people who describe ponderosas in the Rockies often also describe them having a vanilla type odor. So sometimes I take a lot of the identifying features with a grain of salt, but my biggest thing is looking at the cones. If the prickles go down and out and they stick your finger, you're probably looking at a ponderosa. If they're not, you're looking at a Jeffreyi. And the ponderosas, I have sniffed the bark of the ponderosas here in Southern California, and I don't smell the vanilla cookie smell. So it could be the Rocky Mountain subspecies. Those might have more of a vanilla cookie smell, like the Jeffreyi pines out here. But then it shows that they are quite related. And ponderosas, another thing, ponderosas tend to be a little bit taller than Jeffreys. And then again, here, a lot of times they're windswept because we do get gale force winds that come through here very often. So you'll see a lot of these type of trees here in this area that are swept to the back. This is probably from the predominant wind flow right here. So here you have it. Pinus jeffreyi, the Jeffreyi pine. One of the neatest trees you'll find hiking. One of the most common trees you'll find hiking here in the San Gabriels. And quite an awesome species of tree. Come check them out here in the San Gabriels. Or pretty much anywhere up through the Sierras here in Southern California up to Oregon.